plants do crazy things. They're so different from us because they can't move, since they haven't been able to evolve locomotion or movement and behavior as we sort of think of it with animals. They've really evolved all this chemical diversity to use to deal with the changing environment that they find themselves rooted in. And that has required a tremendous genetic architecture. The organism on Earth with the most genes and the most chromosomes and the most genetic material are all plants. It's fascinating just how plants have pushed the boundaries of evolution to the superlative in order to cope with their environment and the fact that they can't move.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Epic Gardening Podcast. Today we have a really awesome guest. We have Ari Novy, who's the president and CEO of the San Diego Botanic Garden. In fact, just last week, our team was up there for the World of Houseplants exhibit. Had a lot of fun. Actually saw the corpse flower, not in bloom, but post-bloom, I suppose, with the huge leaf. I've never seen one in person, so it was a really cool moment for me.
That's an awesome plant. Yeah, that one just went in through its leaf cycle. And, if we're lucky, it'll be in leaf for, maybe 12 months, a little more. And then after that, hopefully we'll get another flower.
Yeah, I do want to be up there for the flower. I was learning that the smell is truly pretty intense.
Oh, it's rough. Yeah, I've always described it as like, a teenager's bag of gym shorts with a little bit of fish and maybe some, meat thrown in and like left on the side of the road, like on a hot day in Borrego.
Oh my gosh,
it's rough.
That's quite the mental image you just painted there. It kind of brings us to this idea of like, we hear a lot about evolution of all species, but I think we pay more attention probably to animal species. And as gardeners, not a lot of us have like crazy botanical knowledge. Mostly it's practical in the garden, but what should we know about just kind of like the basics of plant evolution?
Well, first of all, I love not being apologetic about being a giant plant nerd. Plants make up 85% of the living things on Earth by weight. Mm-hmm. And so, when we're learning about plants, we're really learning in a very deep way about our planet and our biosphere. So it feels sometimes like a little trivial because people care more about animals than plants, but I think plants are just, I like to say plants are almost everything in quite the literal sense. And how have plants come to dominate the world so much? I mean, they are the predominant life form on Earth, terrestrial plants. It's really interesting. I mean, one of my favorite narratives about the story of plant evolution is it's essentially figuring out how to have sex with very little water, how to have very dry sex.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that kind of gets you into like the spreading of seeds and all that kind of stuff, right?
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, you think about, plants when they were more similar to animals. You go back to our lower plants like mosses and ferns, and they have swimming sperm, right? So their reproductive, organs and propagule materials, they, at some point create a sperm that has to swim through water, just like, humans and mammals, we have that. And part of what plants did in colonizing all of terrestrial land was figure out how to continue their reproductive processes without a lot of moisture around. And so slowly, you get the advent of things like pollen that can be dispersed on the wind or by insects, from flower to flower. And then that pollen opens and no longer does a swimming sperm come out, but a pollen tube, which is kind of like a little root almost, it looks like, that grows and elongates as cell elongation into an ovary to produce fertilization. And that's really unique in the, living world. There are no other organisms that are able to complete their reproductive cycle, with water never being sort of a part of that.
Yeah, I always think like now that I'm such a gardener, apparently, the epic gardener, whatever you want to call it, I studied economics in college though. And I've always thought like if I ever were to go back, plant genetics or the hard sciences of some kind would have been my choice, and I would have had a little bit more knowledge in this area.
I think you're doing pretty good. I read your website. It's full of great, wonderful, scientifically accurate information. So, you are doing a great job. Ironically, if I got to go back, I would be an economist.
You really?
If I could do 2 degrees, if I could go back and do one more, I would do economics.
You are president CEO of a botanic garden. Is probably some interesting business acumen you need to develop there, right?
Ideally, we do. One of my great mentors told me that the most important fertilizer for any garden is green, and it is called money. And so we do need to earn money, otherwise we can't grow the garden. So there's some economic principles at play. But but plants are my first love. My PhD is in plant biology and mainly in plant genetics. And so I do hear you, and it is fun. Plants do crazy things. They're so different from us because they can't move. So they've since they haven't been able to evolve, locomotion or movement and behavior as we sort of think of it with animals, they've really evolved all this chemical diversity to use to deal with the changing environment that they find themselves rooted in. And that has required a tremendous genetic architecture. Plants, they break all the records, right? So the organism on Earth with the most genes and the most chromosomes and the most genetic material are all plants. It's fascinating just how plants have pushed the boundaries of evolution to the superlative in order to cope with their environment and the fact that they can't move.
So here's a question. It's kind of an oddball question, but I've been seeing it going around just on social media or Twitter or wherever, right? And it's this whole trend towards people who only want to eat meat. And that part of their logic is plants, being that they can't move, they have to evolve sort of ways to defend themselves against predators and consumption, have evolved, and I know this is of course not true across all species, obviously, have evolved sort of protective chemical mechanisms to like dissuade them from being eaten. And they'll say like, oh, well, like spinach has, oxalate in it. And if you eat enough of it, then it's going to kill you. It's like, okay, but the quantity you'd have to eat is so large. It's clearly not a big deal. And I'm not so much asking you to comment on that, but more like, how interesting and are there any interesting examples of that just from your knowledge of plants sort of evolving that kind of response?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, again, plants, because they're such amazing chemical, innovators, they do fascinating things. And what, of course, there's so many plants that are safe. Obviously, plants form the basis of our system. And even if you eat meat, I mean, the meat ate plants, so
exactly
it's there in the system. But yes, some of the most profound poisons are come from plants. And one that grows as a weed here in San Diego County and across much of the United States is Ricinus communis. And ricin is a really nasty, protein that is very, very poisonous. It's hard to chemically purify it, from castor bean is the common name for that plant. But if you do that, it can kill you very, very, very quickly. Interestingly, that same plant also produces castor oil, which is a really important, therapeutic in a lot of senses. So, yeah, I mean, plants produce some nasty stuff, and sometimes you need to be careful. But there are very few to almost no reported accidental poisonings with plants, every year throughout the whole country, based on the data that we have. And so, while plants, certainly are capable of, and do produce very dangerous chemicals, humans have been pretty good at understanding which plants we can consume and which ones we can't, which ones we can turn into medicines that should be taken, but only under very specific circumstances. And, most humans are not in the business of randomly eating large quantities of plants that they don't usually eat. And so risk is very minimal and reward is, of course, very high.
Do you ever think, I mean, we can't actually know this, but do you ever think about that whole sort of trope of like the first person to try this or the first person to try that? Like back in the day, how did we figure out mushrooms were edible? Like someone had to go just try it and see what happened. And obviously, we've probably lost some human beings to certain things along the way. I've always wondered about that. It's something we can never know historically, right? I mean, it's so many thousands of years ago, these discoveries probably happened, but it's just fascinating to me.
I do. I think about that all the time. And, I think like the simple explanation is, people are out there trying foods to survive and occasionally, eat something like, mushrooms in particular can be very deadly at very low amounts if you don't know the right mushroom. But I also think, there's never been an era, as far as I know, where humans were like really embraced, death very willingly just to try some sort of a new food. And I think, even pretty poisonous things, like for example, rice, and going back to the castor bean, if you or I were to take one castor bean and eat it and really chew it really well, and we wouldn't die, an adult wouldn't die. We'd feel terrible for like quite a few days, right? And so that's a pretty strong signal not to eat this thing.
Yeah.
And so I think people were always smart. I mean, I think that, when you're eating something new, unless you were really in kind of a starving situation and you had no choice, people would eat small amounts. And, I mean, people probably, we all know today who are the people with the strongest stomachs in our, circle. And, those people, have always existed, and they might try small amounts and be the tasters or something like that.
Interesting. Yeah.
I mean, the bigger risk with plants has always been stuff that is sort of low level toxicity that has like a cumulative effect over time. And, one of the really strong ones that affect our food supply. So like ergot is a fungus that affects rye in particular and some other grains that we've used historically. And there's some nasty alkaloids in there that really cause hallucination and even death. And some scientists and historians even believe that like the Salem witch trials were sort of mass hysteria caused by ergot poisoning from rye in Massachusetts back in the day. So there's a lot of interesting stuff going on. But then again, you don't want to be out there eating rancid meat either, right? So
yeah, I mean, yeah, it's just such a fascinating thing. I learned about ricin for the first time ever from an episode of Breaking Bad when it's been such a long time the show's been out, it's not really a spoiler, but Walt pulls an interesting move with that compound. So that's how I learned about it. And then I found it out in Santa Barbara hiking in the hills. Oh, right. I was using my Google Lens to identify a bunch of stuff, and I was like, oh wow, no way, there it is, sitting right there.
I mean, it's very common. I see it along the 5 in San Diego all the time, growing as a weed along highways and roads. And there are some beautiful, varieties of castor bean that are sold as ornamentals. And I mean, it's, the leaves are gorgeous, big palmate, reddish leaves. And people have bred them for their beauty.
Yeah, fascinating. I mean, so much to learn in the world of plant evolution. Probably could do a whole week. Maybe we'll do that sometime. But have you ever wondered how we even have the ability to see certain plants, whether it be at a garden, a botanic garden, a museum, I suppose? It really all comes down to conservation and the people who do that work. I guess, Ari, this is something I actually don't know a whole lot about, sort of the mechanics behind plant conservation. I learned a little bit at the houseplant exhibit that I went to, but how does it even work? Like, how would you even know what to conserve?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think as botanic gardens and our allied institutions have gotten, more into the work of conservation over the last several hundred years, we didn't know the answers to those questions either. And at the beginning, it was just conserve everything, right? In some ways, you could say botanic gardens started as, the attempt for an encyclopedia of actual living plants or a library of living plants. And so it was just, hey, we recognize plants are important in our lives. They bring us food and fiber and fuel and medicine and so much that's important to us. And we better, have them at the ready. Later on, as we were continuing in that process, we also then became aware that human activity, as well as non-human activity, leads to plant extinction, or at least, changes in relative abundance of plants in the wild. And so therefore, wow, if there are plants that we, want to hold on to, either just for posterity's sake or for specific use reasons, they are at risk of, no longer being present in nature. We believe, science tells us that 99% of all species that ever lived, including plant species, are extinct, right? Extinction is a part of life. But, we don't want to lose those resources, and we certainly don't want to lose those resources when those plants are still really important for the ecosphere and for us. So, starting in about the first half of the 20th century, botanic gardens really started to look at abundance of plants out in nature and tried to catalog which ones are really kind of, not doing well. They're at risk of not being available anymore through extinction or something like that. And we began to prioritize, those plants. And that's a lot of work. There's about 400,000 plant species in the world. Right now, botanic gardens have living, collections of over a third of those worldwide, according to our data sharing. So there's a lot of work to do, but we've prioritized the rarest first. And so we're doing relatively well, but it's a challenging endeavor, and then there's lots of questions for what you do with these plants and how you share them once you have them.
Yeah, I guess it's so. Would you say there's sort of in the world of botanic gardens, which I don't really interface with besides going to them, is there this sort of shared mission of like, hey, we're all in this together as botanic garden operators, trying to effectively catalog the world of plants and preserve them? Sort of like a shared mission.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny. I mean, I've been involved in a lot of different kind of scientific communities in my career, and the plant world, the botanic garden world, and the beekeeping world, for whatever reason, those are the two that are just the most sharey. They just don't sort of feel in competition with one another. And they don't, they're not, we're generous hoarders. I kind of like to think of the botanic garden community. So we actually, there are umbrella organizations. There's an organization called Botanic Garden Conservation International, which maintains it's a secretariat under the United Nations, and so it has the sort of formal responsibility of maintaining the list of plants that are held at botanic gardens worldwide, so that information can, be utilized to meet conservation goals. And what we do is each botanic garden is constantly checking our own collections versus that sort of, worldwide, collection made up of all of our gardens, and resetting our priorities to do the right thing. And one of the most important things is, like, sometimes we'll run a data analysis of our collections, and we'll find, oh my God, we have a plant that like nobody else has, or maybe only one or two other institutions. And that's like, alarm bells go off, and we go, oh my God, that's bad. We need to get this to other places, because any one garden is at risk of, a natural disaster, or, the water kind of gets cut out, or a fire comes through. And so, we really have to conserve by dissemination, by propagation and dissemination. The network is really important.
So if you guys find that to be the case at San Diego Botanic, you'll immediately start to try to propagate it in some way.
Exactly. Yeah. And one of the things that we're really excited about, so, botanic gardens, have a kind of unholy amount of plant diversity that's concentrated typically in a relatively small location. So, as an example, we're here in San Diego County. San Diego County is the most plant biodiverse county in the entire United States. It has about 2,000 different plant species. We have about 5,000 different plant species at San Diego Botanic Garden on 37 acres, right? So, in the United States, the most diverse county, which is huge. I don't even know how big San Diego County is, but it's an enormous county, has 2,000 plant species, and that's a lot. Now you're like taking more than twice that and shoving it into 37 acres. So, one of the interesting skill sets that botanic gardens have to develop first, the people who work there, are caring for that many different kinds of plants, each one with unique, needs and conditions. And so we talk to we love our colleagues in other botanic gardens. We know the kinds of conditions that are at other botanic gardens. And so if we have plants that we really think should be gotten out there to other institutions, we know who has the skill, and the conditions to grow those plants. And we work really well together in order to do that.
So you might say, I don't know, I'm just going to make an example up. There's a particular piece of bamboo in your guys' forest that you're like, actually, it'd probably be better off in this one. And then let's at least send some over there so that it has a better shot at surviving. We know how to care for it, but maybe the climate doesn't support it as well as it would in, I don't know, Florida or something.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And we have those exact conversations. It's cool you chose bamboo, because San Diego Botanic Garden has the national bamboo collection. Our collection is the national collection.
It's incredible, yeah.
And that collection is registered with another sort of, parent organization, or not parent organization, but, association we call the American Public Gardens Association. And so we get that knowledge out of our bamboo collection through that group, and then we can talk with others and do that exact thing. We're having a plumeria conversation right now with the Botanic Garden in Naples, Florida, and they should hold on to the ones that are really good in the humid environment, and we can hold on to the ones that are better in a drier environment. We're doing the same thing with cycads. We have an international cycad working group, and all the institutions that maintain cycads are figuring out how to divvy up the responsibilities in a way that's backed up. We don't want anything only in one place, but also really appropriate for the climate and spaces that the institutions have, because you need to plan for a difficult future. If here in Southern California, if we lose water for a month or two, if all the plants die, then what was the point of all of this? So a lot of the plants we do have can handle at least some level of water loss for a while, or we have other emergency plans that we can deal with with those kinds of challenges.
Yeah. If there was something that you wanted, like, the average layperson that might be walking through the gate at San Diego Botanic to understand about the conservation game, like, what would that one thing be?
I think, we want everybody to know that they can play a role, and we're big believers in, in your home gardens, in your house plants indoors. You can grow rare plants, and that can be important. I mean, there are amazing examples of private collectors, private growers having important plants that weren't present in the botanic gardens or, other sort of, public collections. And, or maybe they were, but only at one place, and they had a fire. And then there was the private collection that came back and reseeded, that plant for, perpetuity. So you can do it. It's not, for some plants, it's not hard. And it's a little bit of learning just to make sure that you're not promoting, plant poaching or unethical means of obtaining those plants. And we're actually doing some interesting work now with professional, with the industry, with the nursery industry, to see if we can't get some more of the rare plants into that industry so that people are buying, cool plants. But for anybody who ever grows a Venus flytrap, you're doing it, right? Venus flytrap is one of the rarest, most endangered plants in the United States. And when you grow one at home and learn how to handle the horticulture of that plant,
Yeah.
you're conserving. You're playing the role. It's awesome.
Maybe we should talk about that, because I have this weird obsession. Perhaps one of the only plants I ever grew as a kid was the Venus flytrap that you bought from wherever, and tried, and I didn't know anything about it. I did not do well with it, and I haven't really done much in carnivorous since then. So have you ever wondered what it is like to actually operate a greenhouse at a botanic garden? I think when you go to, at least when I go to a farm or a nursery of some kind, that feels a little more familiar to me. But we have Ari Novy on the show. He's the president and CEO of the San Diego Botanic Garden. And, Ari, when I was up at the World of Houseplants exhibit, it struck me just how different the conditions would be for operating that particular glass house compared to, let's say, a hydroponic tomato farm, which is a little bit more uniform. And so, what is it actually like to work in one of these spaces?
Well, you just hit the nail on the head with the key difference between botanic garden greenhouses and almost any other kind of greenhouse. Most greenhouses are commercial, in nature, and they're pretty uniform, right? The logic of the commercial enterprise is, I want to grow a lot of, the same or similar plants and get them out for sale. Botanic gardens, we're a little different. We're the opposite. We're trying to grow an incredible diversity of plants in one space. And that's a huge horticultural challenge, because every one of those plants, has different, needs. And yet we're using a greenhouse, which is a controlled growing environment, to do that. And so since the majority of the greenhouse industry, the industry that actually builds greenhouses and the systems that maintain, the conditions within a greenhouse are really driven by the commercial side of it, there's a lot of tweaking and sort of fun that you have to go through to kind of get your greenhouse to be able to handle lots of diversity. Botanic garden greenhouse operation sort of marries the technical side of greenhouse operations and greenhouse systems operations with sort of the artificial attempt to create microclimates, within a greenhouse, and then find, which of those microclimates is the best for all the different plants that you're trying to grow. And that's, for horticulturists who love horticulture, that is a really fun but challenging process. And I've been fortunate. I've been able to be involved in a couple of, really serious, botanic garden greenhouses. And it's a very dynamic process. You start, with a certain set of plants, and you often find, hey, this plant that we put over on the south side of the greenhouse actually wants to be on the north side. And I think the first few years of getting a new major kind of conservatory or greenhouse going, you have to be very flexible and kind of understand what that building is doing and how the microclimates are creating in that space.
Well, what's so interesting about it to me is, I was talking with John, and he was up there, and he was saying the same thing, especially for that particular glass. He's like, for a couple of years, we thought that this anthurium wanted to be here. We moved it to here, and now the leaves are 6 feet long. And it just reminded me of how interesting it is in nature, where the plants sort of figure that out, not necessarily on their own. They can't move. Just the ones that survive in the most optimal spot, and the ones that don't, do not. And so you guys are crafting this environment, and it's human logic sort of watching and replacing things instead of just letting the tapestry of nature play itself out, I suppose.
Yeah, I think we're halfway in between. I mean, I love the way you just drew a parallel between kind of like why plant diversification happens in nature, right? The plants kind of dial into specific niches in the ecosystem, and then they're, more competitive. They're better than their neighbors if they're in the right niche. Now that happens naturally out in nature, through survival of the fittest, but we're kind of trying to harness that. And so we're trying to control it, but we're also recognizing we don't fully have control. And so we have to work with what the plants give us. Our conservatory, you saw it for the World of Houseplants exhibit. It was really designed for mostly epiphytic kinds of plants, right? So a lot of the plants that are present in our greenhouse are actually mounted into hanging baskets, and then these large, what we call plant chandeliers, which are wooden structures with steel reinforcement, where all kinds of epiphytic plants can be, plants that don't need soil and want to be up in the canopy of a rainforest. And that's a pretty unique thing. I mean, and to have a greenhouse that focuses on that. And then our greenhouse further, some of them can be moved up and down depending on what we're doing.
Yeah.
And so, some of the plants, really need to be in what we call our hanging, plant baskets. They stay at the same spot. There's a little bit more uniformity for that, or consistency for that plant. The ones that go up and down, they might need to be a little more plastic and be able to handle some different environments. So, it's a pretty dynamic process, but a lot of fun. A lot of fun.
Here's a question for you on the raw sort of, I guess, ops side of things. How complex is the lighting, the watering, misting systems, like, especially for, I guess, a greenhouse like that one, which is probably quite bespoke?
Yeah, it is pretty complex. When you look at a greenhouse, I mean, you see a building, but really every greenhouse is a giant robot. And if you come to our greenhouses, you'll see one of the things that's really fun to look for in greenhouses are the sensing equipment. So we have several arrays of sensors that are on the exterior of the greenhouse, and so they are getting the conditions outside the greenhouse. And then we have sets of sensors that are inside the greenhouse at key locations, and they're telling the system what's going on inside the greenhouse. And then we're setting, our operators are setting the tolerances for the greenhouse in terms of light, temperature, and moisture, humidity typically. Those are the main three variables we're trying to control, to certain, set points. We want to be, between these areas, and we might want them a certain place during the day and another place at night, or changing in different seasons and all that kind of a thing. So the greenhouse is a robot that is capable of sensing that and then making physical changes to itself in order to achieve, the conditions that we want. It's able to deploy or remove shade cloth to affect the amount of sunlight. We have two separate misting systems, one with a very small droplet that's more like a fog, and one with a larger droplet that's more like a wet mist. Those are independent, and they operate in different parts of humidity, and that's controlled, independently and separate too. We have a heating system that's in the floor. We have, hot water that can run through the floor to keep the space warm in the winter, and then we use passive cooling, the combination of venting, air movement, and then water for evaporative cooling to drive that. And it's amazing how well it works. I mean, there are days where it's over 90 degrees in the summer in San Diego. We've got a glass house with massive solar gain, and we can use those systems to keep the temperature in the 70s if that's where we want to be.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah, that's why. I mean, that's crazy that I would imagine, like you said, solar gain, you're picking up so much heat from a day like that, and you can still vent it out that much. I'm curious because I'm starting the process of having an 8 by 10 foot greenhouse at my place. Little baby steps here, and we'll see. I mean, I'm learning about all the glazing materials and venting and exhaust and all that sort of stuff. Anything else in the world of just like interesting factoids, I suppose, about operating a greenhouse that someone listening might be interested in?
Well, I think, if you're starting with your own greenhouse at home, and I remember when I was about 20, I had my first sort of like plastic greenhouse that I built, right? The whole point of it is that you want to grow plants that, won't do well under the conditions that you currently have, right? The point of a greenhouse is not to have a greenhouse, it's to control conditions and have different conditions than you could otherwise have because there's a specific set of plants or a specific part of plant life cycle, like at the propagation phase or something like that, where you want to create different conditions than you have. So understand your goals, right? So whatever your goals are going to determine what are the conditions you're trying to create, and whatever those conditions are going to determine what technology, you're going to need. And so, for example, botanic gardens typically have glass greenhouses as opposed to poly or, some of the other, substances, because we do not want to lose any optical clarity over time. We want to be able to just replace panes of glass if they break, and know that the spectrum of the light coming from outside is never going to change. And a lot of the polycarbonate products are great for a few years or even longer, but eventually they begin to change the spectrum of light. Now, commercial growers, they understand this and they know how to leverage it, but with the mission that we have, which is growing a diverse group of plants in perpetuity, it's worth it for us to pay the considerably more money for glass because we have a specific goal that's served by that.
Interesting. I never thought of it that way. So I guess like when poly breaks down over time, like the light starts to get diffused and the spectrum perhaps changes, or the PPFD changes or something like that.
That's exactly right. I mean, it's really fascinating because there are different poly products that actually, choose specific parts of the spectrum. So depending on what you're growing, if you have a plant that's more responsive to a certain part of the spectrum than others, you can even purchase a poly product that's, skewing things more towards the spectrum that you want. Some polys, especially older polys, they do gain opacity, right? They lose transmissibility over time. There are some new technologies that are out there. Some of these new polys, they've been going for 10, 20 years, and they don't seem to have that much, if any, loss. But we'll see what happens. It depends on your climate. And then there's some really new technologies. There's this neat product called F-Clean. It's a transparent Teflon, believe it or not. And, I think the longest standing ones of those have been up for about 30 years, and they don't lose any transmissibility. So we're starting to get some new technology out there that, that mimics glass in some ways. They have other properties. So it'd be interesting to see in the future. We might see a lot less glass. But for now, glass is, if you don't want to lose transmissibility, it's still the thing.
It's the thing, and then also aesthetically, there's something about a glass house that just looks so good, to me at least.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. And the fact that you have to do the smaller panes with glass, and it gives you that, our greenhouse is certainly not Victorian, but it, you sort of feel that history of Victorian glass houses present in the design, even if it's not a Victorian style.
I walked through in 2019 Kew Gardens in London, and I was like, wow, these things are just massive. And there's a little agedness to the glass, or something's on it, and it just has this little, I don't know, it's a vibe. Let's just say that.
Those are gorgeous. I mean, those are gorgeous. There's two great Victorian, large glass houses at Kew. They have some modern ones too. The Alpine Collection is in a really interesting modern greenhouse, as well as the Princess of Wales Conservatory there. Though, if you love greenhouses or you love plants, if you can make it to London at some point in your life, go to Kew.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. We've talked about native plants a bit here on the show, as well as what even qualifies as a native plant. And I have to imagine, Ari, that you guys do work and catalog quite a bit of San Diego natives. We have one of the more biodiverse regions out there.
Yeah, we love the San Diego and regional native flora. You're right. San Diego has the most plants of any county in the whole country, with about 2,000 plant species. But we do it all, though. We certainly focus on our local flora because we're the Botanic Gardens here. We have that, that knowledge and experience. But we also love growing plants from around the world, provided that they're not invasive, and also that they're appropriate for our climate. And so we do focus a lot on the 5 Mediterranean regions of the world, of which Southern California is one, because those are, plants that are going to grow pretty well in our garden. But we love the native plants, and we like to encourage people, who want to work with native materials in their home landscapes as well, because it can be very rewarding.
Yeah, that's something we had a guest on a little bit ago talking about natives, and I have this curb strip in front of my house, which is actually quite large. It's like 8 feet wide by 70 feet, something absurd like that. There's the only thing left there is one palm tree that I don't think I can reasonably remove. So my idea is to do that whole curb strip with natives. And I guess I'm curious, there are some obvious benefits to natives, but if you wouldn't mind kind of sharing some of those for people who are getting interested in this.
Yeah, definitely. So, native is I think it's important to acknowledge that it's a human term, right? I mean, plants don't think of themselves as native or non-native, but, we do tend to identify a regional flora and say, okay, these are the plants that are from here originally, that without human intervention would be the plants that grow here. And, because they're the plants that are, adapted to that particular region, they do tend, as a general trend, to be hardier, and they survive well. They're attuned, or tuned to the our rainfall patterns, right? So a lot of native plants from our region, they expect to be dry in the summer and get the rain in the winter, and they also have more relationships, more beneficial relationships with local wildlife. And so if you're wanting to support the local wildlife, whether it's the birds, the bees, the coyotes, whatever you want. Some of those native plants are going to help, more. Now, that doesn't mean that the non-native plants don't do any of those things. They absolutely do. We also talk about well-adapted non-native plants, which means they're not invasive, they're good for our region, and they some of them do have wildlife value. So we try not to be dogmatic about it, but we do recognize that there's a less of a history of using the native plants for ornamental horticulture in the home. And we're really encouraging people to explore that more, because it's a fun aspect of gardening, and it's a really fun way to, sort of hammer on the sense of place of where we live. I mean, plants are really a primary determinant of our sense of place and the aesthetic quality of a place, in nature. And using those native plants kind of brings that natural sense of place into the neighborhoods, which is also a wonderful thing.
Yeah, as far as San Diego goes, let's say, I'm not going to say, hey, design this curb strip, but, if there are some feature plants from San Diego, where would you suggest someone like myself look?
Well, there's a few good native nurseries. I'm up in North County, so I don't know South County as well, but Moosa Creek, up here is pretty good. And then just over the border in Orange County is a really wonderful all native plant nursery called Tree of Life. And they also do collecting in San Diego, so they have a lot of San Diego native plants too. But there's many, many others, and I think Walter Anderson is great, and Anderson Lacosta, and there's a lot of great places, and I think native plants they have a buzz, and so you're seeing more and more of them out there. The nurseries are probably a bit limited by native plant supply, and that's an interesting thing that we love getting engaged in. But there are some great native plants that are perfect for like that kind of curb area, right? And you got to think about it. The curb area, that's a tough place, right? It's getting extra heat off the asphalt of the road. Maybe even cars are kicking in some oil and grease and nasties, and so you want those plants that are tough. And we have some great ones in our native flora. One of my favorites is lemonade berry, which is a beautiful plant. It's a great parking lot plant, meaning it's tough enough for a parking lot, and it can hold a hedge. It can be grown wild. The berries are really cool, and they're good for wildlife, and even I like to eat them. So, there's some great plants out there, for any and every environment in the home garden.
I remember I went to, I think it was a California Native Plant Society's sale in Balboa, I believe. And I didn't know much about natives at the time, still don't know a ton, and was just flabbergasted at the varieties that I had. It's just unlike any nursery you're going to go to, everything is so unique.
Yeah, and California Native Plant Society is just awesome. We work with them a lot. The San Diego chapter is super active. Their plant sale is amazing. So that's a great place to go. They're very welcoming, and they have wonderful web resources too. They have a plant finder, kind of a portion of their website that you can put in where you live and all kinds of stuff, and it'll spit out all kinds of cool native plants that are good for you and that are available in the trade. So that's a really exciting resource, and we're very lucky in San Diego County to have people who care about this. The other folks who are really good are the master gardeners. The master gardeners love teaching you about native plants. And
interesting question, I guess, is how do they get the plants? How does someone like CANPS get the actual plants? Do they just go out and get them, or?
That's a great question. I don't know their exact story. I don't know if they operate their own nursery. But the general process is somebody's got to go out into nature and find the plants that they want, and determine which ones are good. Make sure they have all the right permits and are doing everything properly to obtain those plants, so that they can safely, successfully, ethically be propagated from wild materials. And then typically there's some sort of an evaluation period where people grow out some of the plants that are taken from nature, as they're usually either taken as seed or cuttings, and see how they do. Do they grow into nice plants? Are they going to be useful for homeowners? And then if they are, then you start to work with some nurseries. There are some nurseries, like some of the ones I mentioned earlier, that they do this themselves. They have their own plant people who go out and find them. They're really juiced in with local authorities and native plant societies and others, so they're trusted and do it all right. And other times, these are some native plants have been brought into cultivation hundreds of years ago, and they've just been existing in cultivation for a long time. We do this. We're currently working with the Bureau of Land Management in the Otay Mountains, wildlife management area, and we have specific permits and specific grants to actually collect certain plants that we think might be good introductions for native ornamental plants. We're targeting right now a plant called Lepikinia ganderi, which is also a rare plant, and we think it's great if people plant rare plants in their gardens, assuming it's the right location and all that, because then people get to be a part of conserving plants. And some of these native rare plants are beautiful. They're wonderful for wildlife. They're tough as nails if they're in the right place. But they're becoming endangered in many cases because of the development that's happening in the habitat that they would normally be in.
Got it. I was going to ask if it wouldn't be poaching in this case. People don't even really, there's no value associated to them, at least currently. So I was wondering what would be causing them to be less common.
No, I mean, some of these plants are naturally just very restricted to certain areas. One plant we love to talk about is endangered by development is Del Mar manzanita. So that's one of the local manzanitas. It's like us. It wants to live in the exact same places that we want to live. It wants a nice view of the ocean from up on a bluff. And so since we've built houses in those locations and that's where that plant wants to be, there's just very little of its original habitat left. So, we and others are working to, catalog where that plant still is, try to, help, provide reasons to protect those areas. And of course, bring them into the garden so that we can, affect restoration. But also that's a good landscape plan too. And you can
I'm looking
get
at
that
it right
one.
now. It looks great.
Yeah, you can get that one. I just, I was asked to be on a panel to review some landscape plans for the Natural History Museum in Balboa Park, and they put Delmar manzanita into that landscape, and I was like, that's great, that's awesome. So, they're out there, and there's a lot of really cool ones.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I mean, an interesting idea would be to put it right back into the yards of those homes in Del Mar.
That's it.
There you go.
That's it.
Awesome. I'm curious, do you do a lot of just home backyard gardening yourself, Ari?
Not as much as I would like. I do have a backyard, and I mostly grow fruit trees, and I have kids, and we grow a couple different varieties of tomatoes every year, and I have a couple other interesting things. But I'm very busy, and I don't have as much time for it as I would like, and I don't like taking my work home with me too much.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I mean, I know for us here at FPIC, we have our whole thing is teaching people to grow mostly food crops, and it's been an interesting year, at least here in San Diego. Myself and one of our creators, Jacques, who actually lives somewhat close by to me. I mean, our rainfall this year is even less than we thought it would be, and we knew it would be low. And so obviously things are changing, right, in the climate. And I'm curious if you guys have seen that, and what your thoughts are there.
Yeah, I mean, it absolutely is. I mean, this year has been very little rain. It's so funny because we've overall had hardly any rain, and then we've had these little monsoonal spits this summer, which are kind of unusual for us. Although exactly what climate change has been, the climate change scientists have been predicting. I mean, these monsoonal rains that we think of as more typical for the other side of the mountains, out in the Sonoran Desert and into Arizona, they're stronger, and so they can kind of push, those systems can push through over the mountains and come to us, which historically has been pretty unusual. So there's a lot of nervousness, that some of the climate models predict that that San Diego area may develop a more bimodal rain distribution in the future. So historically, our flora is adapted to really just a wet winter and then very, very little rain, through the summer. Typically, we've gotten more rain in the winter, than we've gotten recently. And so there's at least some wet soil down underneath there that kind of helps the plants through the summer. So that's one change, right? That we've, the winter rains are failing some years, and we're in deeper drought with deeper groundwater and all that stuff. But then there's this fear that way in the future, we're actually going to have significant, maybe less winter rain, but still winter rain, and then more monsoonal summer rain. And a lot of the plants we plant don't like that. And over time, we're going to have to really see what happens and adjust our planting, to what nature gives us.
That would be very interesting. I do remember, at least this year, it was like maybe 3 sort of heavy-ish rains, and then that was pretty much it. And we had something random in June, I believe.
That's exactly right.
At least where I was at. It's bad when you can remember.
It's really bad. And we're up in Encinitas, and we had, I guess it was 2 years ago in April, the rainiest day on record in Encinitas, after sort of a failed, winter rain and then nothing for a while. But then we get 6 inches in one day, which is absolutely crazy.
You got 6 in a day?
Yeah, that's the most ever in a 24-hour period in record keeping in Encinitas, which goes back to the late 1800s. And
that's insane.
And, you don't want that. I mean, that's too much rain. It's messing up trees and washing vegetation away. And so climate change is giving us a lot of people talk about extreme weather, right? So sometimes when it does rain, it pours more. When it's droughty, it's really droughty. I mean, we're talking about the current drought as like we haven't had a drought like this in 1,200 years or more, based on the geological evidence. So it's very extreme. And so as gardeners, we have to kind of think about, what does that mean, right? How do we handle that? And if we're vegetable, growing, are we switching over to some plants that can handle that a little bit more? Are we prepared to irrigate? If we're prepared to irrigate, is that responsible? I mean, right now, most of us should probably be thinking about how to irrigate less.
Yeah.
So I love this challenge. You asked me what plants I like to grow at home. The truth is, my wife would hate this, but I like growing plants that barely want to survive. That's kind of like my weird little plant fetish. So I do love working with the plants that maybe according to Hoyle, want more water, but we don't give it to them and see can they make it and how does that impact things. And I used to love to try to grow citrus where they didn't want to grow, like in shade with very little water, and and see like what varieties can be pushed. I'm not a commercial producer. I'm not working for Sunkist, so like I'm okay with pulling off 2 or 3 oranges a day, not 50. And so maybe certain varieties can kind of handle that kind of stuff, and so that's a fun, to me, part of gardening is like how low can I turn the irrigation. Sometimes it's actually you're watering a lot, but very infrequently. I just had a great tree conversation with a local tree expert, and he's like, in the summer months, 3 waters a year, but put on your soaker hose and do 24 hours, and that's much less water than you'd use. You're getting 3 times a week. But it's changing our conception of how we do these things to handle this climate.
Yeah, I mean, we just put in drip across the entire property, at least at my house, on 15 different zones, and I'm like getting obsessed with like calibrating these zones to kind of like you're saying, like, okay, and I was doing like 2 times a week 45 minutes, and now I'm like 3 times a week 20 minutes, which is 10 less minutes, you know what I mean? And the results seem to be better. I have a shower. I just finished an outdoor shower that goes into a gray water basin that goes into my citrus, effectively just hoping that my amount of shower water is fine for them, and that isn't so much infrequent. It's sort of like a little bit every single day, which I'm actually not sure citrus prefers, but we'll see what happens. They seem to be doing fine. So yeah, there's a lot of changes that I think we're probably gonna have to make here in San Diego.
Yeah, and we can learn a lot. I mean, we're at the tip of the spear. I mean, it's arid here, and we have to get used to that. But there's others. I mean, one of the things they've learned in Israel using a lot of recycled water, which is basically gray water, is that a lot of plants can handle some gray water, especially if you're dripping it, right, not applying it to the foliage. And then every once in a while, you need to do a soak with cleaner water, right? Yeah, flush. And so it's, like that's another level of dynamicism, right? It's like, not always using the same quality of water. And, you might be able to get away with a lot lower quality water if once in a while, once a quarter, once in every half year, you flush, and get the electrolytes that maybe those plants aren't thrilled about, just out of the root zone.
That's an interesting idea, yeah.
We all get to learn a lot in this process. And, I think it's, obviously climate change, it can be very destructive. It's not that we shouldn't be happy about it coming. But, the sort of silver lining is like maybe it will push us to get really innovative, adopt practices that, really are, conserving, and allow us to have a high quality of life, in places like Southern California where, water is certainly already not abundant and there's risks that it might be even less abundant in the future.
Lots of experiments. I'm going to have to try the flush method with my orchard and see if that does anything. I never really considered that, but yeah, I'll give that a try. I'll let you guys know how it goes in a future episode. But I was up at the San Diego Botanic Garden for the World of Houseplants exhibit and saw the corpse plant in real life, which you really do have to see it to believe it. It seems like something that, at least I feel, Dr. Seuss would have maybe drawn. I think we could, of course, talk a little more about the corpse plant, Ari, but is there anything else at the Botanic Garden that is sort of shockingly common, but you don't see the plant that often?
Oh yeah, those are some of the plants that people get the most excited about. And I would say, I'm often asked, what's my favorite plant? I can't choose because they're like my kids. But what I usually respond is that it's the chocolate tree, Theobroma cacao, which we think comes from the Amazon, but was moved around quite a bit, in pre-Columbian times by indigenous people throughout the Americas because it's such an awesome plant. And this is the plant that really chocolate comes from. But it's a true tropical. You really can't grow it outdoors in San Diego, and so most people have never seen it. It's really cool. It produces these pods. We call them the cacao pods, which are typically orange, yellow, or red at maturity, and they grow directly out of the trunk, which is kind of weird. Botanically, that's called cauliflory. And so you get kids, and you say, "Do you like chocolate?" And they go, "Yeah, of course we love chocolate." And you go, "Hey, this plant makes chocolate," and they go, it's like in a second they go, oh, plants are important. Like they're responsible for chocolate. And I just love that. And at our garden, you can see plants like that. And we maintain them in a way that you can see the fruits very frequently. And we can talk about the process of how chocolate is made.
A while ago, a couple years back, I got a box of tropical fruits from a company in Miami, and cacao pod was in it. And that was my first time actually holding one. And then so I cut it open and pulled out the seeds, I believe, and then just sort of ate the exterior sort of white, I don't know the botanical term for it, but the white casing.
It's called mucilage.
The mucilage, yeah, delicious, absolutely delicious. And it does look like mucilage, but it was surprisingly sweet and sort of tropical and fruity and very tasty. And then I tried to eat some of the raw, cacao inside, and it was a really interesting experience. And it kind of gave me an appreciation. I was in Hawaii recently and saw a huge tree, pods all over the place, and it's just like, wow, that's where it's from.
Yeah, it's so cool, and that mucilage is amazing. In the tropics, they eat it all the time. It doesn't ship well unless you ship the whole fruit, and so we rarely get to taste something like that here. So that's a cool experience that you had.
Yeah, I noticed up there you guys had the vanilla orchid as well.
We have that right next to the cacao tree, so we can kind of be like, look, this is like most of the flavoring that you need to make chocolate chip cookies, and just add a little sugar and some flour, and you're there, little eggs, but yeah, it's interesting. We love orchids. I mean, everybody loves orchids. They're so beautiful. But the vanilla orchid, Vanilla planifolia, is the main species that's commercially used for vanilla, is the only what's considered an economic orchid. It's really the only orchid, or the one of the only orchids that's grown for like a farming product. And vanilla is so hard to grow. It takes, it's really hard to get the flowers to pollinate. It takes a really long time for the vanilla bean to form. And then it has to be very gingerly harvested, and then there's a long processing, a series, that can't be sped up. It takes like weeks or months, and so it's very labor intensive. And when you sit with people and show them the plant, and we do try to coax them to grow vanilla beans and everything, we explain that process, and people go, "Oh, I understand now why vanilla is so expensive." And we also talk about like when you tasted that cacao, seed, it did not taste like chocolate. It was chalky and astringent and bitter, and so there's all these processing steps that are required to get to the products that we sort of perceive of as chocolate or vanilla, and that's an interesting conversation for people to understand too.
Yeah, have you guys ever actually gotten a proper vanilla bean on that plant you have up there?
Yes, but we've never, we've been able to bring the beans to maturity, but we've never attempted to do the processing to get the vanilla flavors in it. So a mature vanilla bean from the orchid does not taste like vanilla. It needs to go through a sort of series of heating and cooling. So they're placed out into the sun in some parts of the world where they're grown, during the day, and then gathered up and taken in at night because they can't get wet, and they do this for sometimes weeks. And slowly, these it's a physiochemical change that allows the different vanilla flavoring chemicals to emerge, and to form, within that pod, what we call post harvest.
That's so interesting. It kind of goes back to what we chatted about on that first episode, but almost in a different way of like not so much who's the first person who went and ate a mushroom or whatever, but it's mostly like how did someone even figure out that you could run it through that process and get something so tasty at the end?
That's a great question.
So complicated,
There's a couple of apocryphal stories, and I don't know the vanilla ones, but one of my favorites is, coffee, and we also, have a coffee tree, at the Botanic Garden. People love coffee and love seeing where it comes from. But, coffee is a sort of relatively recent human, beverage. It sort of goes back to the Middle Ages, and it comes from, Northern Africa. And, the apocryphal story is that a goat herder was out, and, he sort of noticed his goats eating the berries off of this coffee bush, and the goats like just got all happy, and they started running around and prancing, and, they got kind of a caffeine rush. And like that observation, led him, and others to try, to prepare, coffee in a way that humans could consume it, and eventually led to roasting coffee beans and us, grinding coffee. I have a little personal story. So I used to, run the National Botanic Garden in Washington, D.C., which has a big, beautiful conservatory. And in our tropical, in the tropical, rainforest, there was a very large African plant from the Bignoniaceae family, the sort of trumpet vine family. And some of these plants in Africa, they get these giant flowers, and the flowers fill with nectar, and the nectar just stays in them. And we had one that was, near the edge of the glass. And on a really hot summer day, it started fermenting, and it smelled like beer. It really smelled like beer. And I kind of walked by it, and then we had a canopy walk. So I was like 30 feet up in the air, and I was like, it smells like beer here. And then I was like, maybe did someone spill beer? What's going on? And then I realized it was this giant flower with nectar fermenting in it. And I thought to myself, okay, this is how
Yeah,
maybe
yeah.
somebody started thinking about fermenting plant juices to make alcohol.
Sure.
Something happened in nature at a chance moment when they're like, what's going on? And and I'll admit,
They're like,
I tasted it. It was good.
Let me try that. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's like, oh,
Yeah.
I feel kind of good too. Alcohol.
Yeah.
And I think in our modern world, we don't typically observe out in nature the way I think people probably did in the past when they were living as hunter-gatherers or in other ways in much more close proximity to nature. And it's hard for us to imagine the kinds of observations that led to the human ingenuity that gave us these very basic foods that we know how to make today, but can't imagine how we even discovered. And
yeah.
And I think it's fun to think about that. Like, what
It
were
is,
people
yeah.
doing that they noticed this stuff,
That is, yeah, I know. I mean, I think, I don't know where it was said, but it's like most things are discovered, not invented, like the ideas came from a place. It didn't come from your brain. It came from an experience that then you of course developed in your own intellect. And so I think, just having a backyard garden, I noticed different little, it's not some crazy discovery, but I'll be like, oh, there's a ton of earthworms directly in the rhizosphere of onions and garlic for some reason. I don't know exactly why that is, but it's way more than would be in my peppers or my tomatoes. I really don't know why. I just noticed that that's the case. And so maybe I'll do something with that knowledge in the future. Maybe I won't. I have no clue.
No, I mean, that is so awesome. I mean, I'm a scientist and I love plants. And, I think maybe the most important thing that I ever do and that we ever do at the Botanic Garden is help kids connect to their, inner botanist, right? And, at its core, science is simply the observation of nature, the close, observation of nature and trying to remove the biases and allow us to see nature more clearly and understand how it works. And like what you just described, I mean, I use, when people say, hey, should I garden at home? I say, yes, of course, there's a million reasons. But the most important one is that you will observe. And you will observe it in a new way because you're trying to coax that plant to give you tomatoes or carrots or, garlic or, whatever you're trying to get. And you will notice that. Well, why is this happening? Why is the leaf, color? And you'll notice the worms. And maybe 95% or more of those observations, you won't know what to do with. Wow, there's more worms here. What do I do with that? But at some point, that might be useful. And
it might be, yeah.
It might be huge. I mean, it might, there might be some chemical in there that leads to some blockbuster drug. I mean, who knows, like, what's really going on?
It could be that. I've been like, is it the exudates that the roots are putting out that are somehow more attractive to worms, or like there's more sugars? I don't know.
That's possible. There's also, certain plants, their rhizospheres support a larger food web. So like there maybe there's nematodes that are eating on them, and then there's parasitic, or there's, sort of nematode eating nematodes that eat them.
Right.
And then, then a little larger kind of arthropod, and then the worms come and eat those. And, I don't know. I don't know. But like to me, that's like the spice of life, like that observation and that curiosity. What's driving that? I mean, that's like there's nothing better in the world. And then you get to go back to those plants time and again and be like, is it still happening? Is it a certain time of year? I mean, it's like the essence of discovery.
It's totally, yeah. I mean, it's one of the biggest reasons why I love the garden. When you go to a botanic garden, you think, okay, awesome. I get to see some plants I may have never seen. I get to learn things that I didn't know. But also, botanic gardens keep plants safe in a way that, you may not be super aware of. And, when I was up there, Ari, at the houseplants exhibit, I saw an extremely rare plant that's even well known amongst, people like myself in the houseplant world, the Spiritu Sancti, which is cool for me because my last name is Espiritu. So I feel like at some point I need this plant. I don't know if I'm ever going to be able to get it, but that's a story for another time. And you guys had an interesting incident happen with that plant, right?
Yeah, unfortunately, we did have a theft of a piece of that plant. And this is a Philodendron Spiritus Sancti, and it's from Brazil, and it's, very highly endangered and, only known to now, be in one town in one small area. And it's an epiphytic plant that lives on trees way up in the canopy of the forest. And it's, for some reason has become a real prized, plant for the kind of specialist, houseplant community. And unfortunately, a few years ago, somebody managed to get into the Botanic Garden and sneak in and basically cut off a pretty serious piece of this plant. We worked with law enforcement. We were never able to find enough evidence to, really go after somebody, although we found some circumstantial evidence. But it really highlights this issue that some plants are valuable enough to collectors that really unsavory and ugly and often illegal things happen. And we sort of refer to this when it's in the wild, when people are stealing plants from the wild in ways that they should not. We call that poaching, in the same way that people poach elephants for ivory. And then, of course, if it's a botanic garden, it's not exactly poaching, but it's just theft.
It's pure theft. Yeah.
Although there's a little term in the plant community called prop lifting, like propagation lifting, which is that's usually innocuous. It's like taking a little piece of a plant, but sometimes it can get to a level where it is really challenging.
Yeah, it's interesting that I feel like I wouldn't have the guts to walk into a place and. I mean, look, I love that plant too, and I know that there's probably houseplant people who would do almost anything to get it, save for steal it. But yeah, it's just wild that actually happened.
Yeah, and I mean, this piece of plant that somebody cut off of ours, could have sold for $15,000, right? And so I think that the more valuable the plant, the more likely that somebody who does not have your admirable ethics, might make some bad decisions in life.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it kind of speaks to the entire world of rare houseplant poaching or sort of questionable sourcing.
Yeah, it's the poaching problems are exaggerated in plants that are rare, and especially when those plants are very, very slow growers. So unfortunately, for many years, there have been issues with like succulents, coming from deserts of the world, like Mexico and other places. And then even, especially cacti in Mexico, and then other succulents like from South Africa. And unfortunately, there are markets in the U.S. and, other, sort of wealthy countries, and people will pay thousands of dollars. And so, somebody will go out and take a plant, even if it's on a protected national park or, something like that. So we really try to, work against that happening. The U.S. is a signatory to an international treaty called the CITES Treaty. And that's essentially the treaty that goes back to the 70s that forbids the inter country exchange or sale of rare or endangered plants and animals without proper permitting. And so our botanic garden, the way we participate is that when rare plants are caught at the borders and don't have the proper permitting, the government has a program where they don't want those to die, and if somebody doesn't go take care of them, then they would die. So we actually accept these plants and agree to take care of them, in some cases for long periods of time. And in fact, in our conservatory, a lot of the pitcher plants you see on our green wall were confiscated plants that we are taking care of.
Yeah, I was learning that. We actually did a full tour of that for our YouTube channel, which will come out soon, and that was a piece on it. It was a lot of the nepenthes on there are confiscated plants that sort of are in your care until such time when they might be called as evidence or something like that, which sounds like, from a practical perspective, that time may never come. And so you sort of are entrusted with their care for perpetuity.
That's exactly right. Yeah, we get the offer. It's the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is the lead government agency on this program. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife typically doesn't have inspectors at the ports. And so it's either the customs folks or the USDA, the Department of Agriculture, plant health inspectors, APHIS inspectors that typically find these. And then they, if they identify them as a rare plant, they really quickly contact Fish and Wildlife, and then Fish and Wildlife contacts us. And especially if it's a port that's near us, like Port of Los Angeles or San Diego, and they know our expertise. They know the kinds of plants we're really good at, working with. And so it's kind of like we get a call. And it's like, okay, we got, 150 plants. I need to know in 15 minutes if you're going to take them. And if so, you got to come by tomorrow morning.
Wow.
And, and sometimes they're not even fully identified. They're like, we know they're nepenthes, but we don't know what species or anything because they don't have flowers on them. And they're half dead. They've been sitting. I don't think it was the nepenthes, but one of the sets of plants we have was hidden inside speakers. Like that was how somebody was trying to, smuggle them into the country. So they said, oh yeah, I bought these speakers. And inside every set of speakers were a bunch of succulents, and they were
so weird.
They were not happy.
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah, it's so interesting how the length someone will go to for, I guess, as you said, if the demand is high enough,
Yeah, and I think unfortunately, with internet sales, a lot of people, accidentally purchase poached plants, right? So. We don't have good systems. Like it's not like like wood and chocolate and some of these other products. They have these fair trade labeling where you can be sure that the way it's changed hands has been fair and equitable and legal. We don't yet have that for plants. We're talking about it. The succulent people, the cactus people in particularly, have some beginnings of that are really going well. But what I say for now is that for anybody who buys plants on the internet, and the plants, especially if they don't come from the United States, the species doesn't come from the U.S., or buy from reputable nurseries, right? So like if you're on a website and it's like Etsy and there's no information about where the plants are really coming from, like you can't be sure that those are legal plants.
Yeah.
If you can trace the business back to a bricks and mortar institution that's licensed as a nursery somewhere within the United States, the nurseries are really good actors. Any licensed nursery, they do a great job. They don't want to poach. So, just make sure that the people you're working with are reputable. And you can ask them. You can contact the seller and say, hey, can you prove to me that you're a reputable nursery and that these plants are not poached? And I think the more people ask that question, the more it will drive the industry to maybe enhance, the labeling and just, make sure to get a hold of this. And just so y'all know, this is so serious. I mean, there are plants just in the last few years that have basically been poached to extinction, especially in South Africa. So this is not like onesie twosie, okay, a couple of plants are taken out of a national park. There are whole plants that may already be extinct or will become extinct that were pretty, that were locally abundant just a few years ago because of the economic pressure, to poach these plants and sell them.
It's crazy that it's gotten to that point, but important to know. Ari, thanks for coming on the show this week. It's been really fun learning this part of the plant world that I don't have a lot of exposure to, and I'm sure everyone else has enjoyed as well. If someone wants to get in touch with either yourself or just, I'm assuming the Botanic Garden is probably the best place to send people. Where can they look? Yeah,
I mean, my email address is on the website. So is my phone number. We have an info line at the Botanic Garden. info@sdbgarden.org. We love talking to people about plants, and we try to make ourselves really available. So go on our website. There's lots of ways of contacting us, and whether it's a gardening question or a program question, education question, you got the class that you want to have come to the garden. We will get you to the right person and get that question answered.
Okay, cool. Well, thank you so much. Maybe we'll come back on in the future, and I'm sure I'll be doing a tour up there. So stay tuned, guys. Good luck in the garden and keep on growing.